For more than 1600 years, he was only a legend, a bishop in a seaside town in what is now Turkey, remembered for gifts left quietly in the dark, the man who slowly became Santa Claus. For most of us, the real man was long gone, if he had ever lived at all. Then, restorers in a church in Bari, Italy, lifted the lid on his tomb, and the bones of an actual man were lying in the dark. When scientists rebuilt his face from those bones, one detail stopped them cold. His nose had been broken, not chipped, not worn smooth by time, broken, snapped by a heavy blow, sometime while he was still alive, and left to heal crooked. That is not the face on the Christmas card. The card gives us soft cheeks and a gentle smile, and a man who never had a hard day in his life. The bones give us something else, an old man who had been hurt. And the strange part is, the more the scientists studied those bones, the more the sweet legend and the battered body began to line up. So, who was he really? Not the cartoon in the red suit, the person. The one buried under a marble slab in southern Italy, with a broken nose and worn-out joints, and a life we only pieced back together in the last 70 years. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you are going to see his real face, and you may never look at Santa quite the same way again. Start with the name, because even that has been buried under wrapping paper. Santa Claus comes from Sinterklaas, the Dutch name for Saint Nicholas. And Saint Nicholas was a real bishop who lived in the 4th century in a coastal town called Myra, on the warm southern edge of what is now Turkey. He was not a magical figure at the North Pole. There were no elves, no reindeer, no workshop in the snow. He was a church leader in a hot, dry, Mediterranean country, born to a wealthy family in a town called Patara around the year 270. When he lost his parents young and inherited a fortune, he did something unusual with it. He gave it away. And here's where the legend actually begins. The story that follows him through every century is about 3 sisters. Their father had fallen into poverty, too poor to provide the dowry they needed to marry, which in that world meant the very real danger of being sold into slavery. On 3 separate nights, the story goes, a bag of gold came sailing in through their window in the dark, from someone who never stayed to be thanked. That someone was Nicholas. Gifts, given quietly, in secret, at night, to children who needed them. Think about that for a second. Every stocking hung by a fireplace, every present slipped under a tree while the house sleeps, traces back to a real man doing a real act of kindness in a real town 17 centuries ago. He became the Bishop of Myra, and people loved him. Sailors prayed to him in storms. Parents named him the protector of their children. Story after story gathered around him, some true, some grown in the telling, until the man himself almost disappeared behind them. But he was not only gentle. Nicholas lived through one of the most dangerous stretches in the history of the early church, and the marks that time left on him were still there, carved into his skeleton, waiting for the day someone finally opened his tomb. To understand what they found in that tomb, you have to know how his bones ended up in Italy at all, because Nicholas did not die there. He died in Myra, around the year 343, and he was buried in his own city. For centuries, his tomb sat quietly in his own church, in his own town. But in the year 1087, a group of sailors and merchants from the Italian city of Bari sailed all the way to Myra with a plan. They went to the tomb, and they took him. They carried his bones back across the sea, and in Bari, they raised a great basilica to hold them. A few years later, a pope sealed the relics beneath the floor, and there, St. Nicholas stayed. Devotion was not the only reason. There was rivalry and pride wrapped up in it too. In that age, a city that held the bones of a great saint held something powerful. Pilgrims, prestige, a steady flow of money and status. Bari wanted all of it, and they reached Myra before anyone else could. So the man who spent his life giving things away in secret was himself taken, in the night, and carried off as treasure. For more than 800 years, no one touched him. That changed in the 1950s. The crypt beneath the basilica had grown old and damp, and the floors and walls needed serious repair. To do the work, the heavy stone lid over the tomb had to come off, and the bones had to come out. For the first time since they were sealed away, human eyes were going to see the remains of Saint Nicholas. The church turned to Luigi Martino, a professor of human anatomy at the University of Bari, and asked him to examine what was inside. On the night of the 5th of May, 1953, under the watch of a church commission, the enormous stone slabs were slowly lifted by winches. The top slab alone weighed several tons, and the tomb of St. Nicholas was opened in near silence, for the first time in over 8 centuries. What Martino saw was not tidy. The bones lay scattered, out of order, jumbled from centuries of being moved and resealed, and they were resting in a shallow pool of clear liquid at the bottom of the tomb, a strange dampness the basilica has recorded for centuries and calls the manna. To this day, that clear liquid still gathers in the tomb, and each year the church draws it out. No one has ever fully explained where it comes from. But the strange damp was not what Martino had come to study. The bones themselves were thin, fragile, and many of them were broken. This is the part that still gets me. The most famous gift giver in human history, reduced to a heap of pale, broken bones in a dark stone box, waiting to be read. Because reading him is exactly what Martino set out to do, bone by bone. And the body was about to tell a story that no legend ever had. Martino returned a few years later, in 1957, with more time and better equipment, and this time he did the work properly. Thousands of careful measurements. A full set of X-ray photographs of the skull and the rest of the skeleton. Every detail he could pull from the bones, written down and preserved. Here is what those bones told him. This was a man, an old man, in his 70s when he died, which lines up almost exactly with the tradition that Nicholas died at around 74. He was not tall, somewhere close to 5'4", average for his day, with a slight to average frame. Nothing like the round, heavy, jolly figure we draw on cards today. The real Nicholas was a lean old man, and his skeleton was the skeleton of someone who had suffered. His bones were thin and brittle, worn down by age. He carried severe arthritis in his spine and his pelvis, the kind of deep joint damage that would have made every movement stiff and painful for years before he died. So why? Why would a bishop's body be this worn down? One answer is written into the history itself. Nicholas lived through the persecution of the Roman Emperor, Diocletian, a time when Christians were arrested and imprisoned simply for their faith. Tradition holds that Nicholas was one of them, locked away for years in a cold, damp underground cell. And a body held in cold and damp for years is exactly the kind of body that develops the arthritis Martino was staring at. The bones agreed with the story. But there was one more thing on that skeleton the story had never mentioned. Something on the skull. And it is the detail that would one day give the world his face. Because here is what almost happened to all of it. Martino measured everything, wrote it all down, and then the bones went back into the tomb and were sealed away once more. His numbers, his photographs, his X-ray plates, every scrap of it went into a file. And for decades, that file mostly sat there. The most detailed record ever made of the real St. Nicholas, quietly gathering dust in an archive. If a real man hiding under a myth is the kind of story you want more of, take a second and subscribe. This channel digs up the people that history turned into legends. Now, let me show you who pulled that file back out. Her name is Caroline Wilkinson, and she is one of the most respected forensic artists alive. She builds faces. When police find a skull and no name to go with it, she is the kind of scientist they call, because she can take a bare skull and rebuild the living face that once sat on top of it. She had already given faces back to kings, Richard III of England, Robert the Bruce of Scotland, and then she took on the hardest subject there is, a saint, gone for more than 1,600 years, whose actual skull she was not even allowed to touch. That was the catch. By the time Wilkinson took this on, the bones were sealed back inside the tomb in Bari and completely off limits. She could not hold the skull, she could not scan it. All she had was Martino's work from decades earlier, his measurements, his photographs, his X-rays, flat numbers and images on paper, standing in for a skull she would never see with her own eyes. So, how do you build a real face out of that? You begin with the skull, because the skull is the frame that decides everything else. Then you add the muscles. There are around 26 muscles in the human face, and here is the useful part. They attach in the same places on every one of us. Wilkinson pins each muscle onto the skull, in the layer where it belongs, and stretches it into position. Over the muscles goes a layer of skin. And because every skull is a slightly different shape, a different face grows on top of it. The bone quietly decides the man. For the finer details, the things bone alone cannot tell you. She used tissue depth data taken from people in Turkey, the same part of the world Nicholas came from, so the thickness and softness of the face would match the region he was actually born in. This was not a guess dressed up as science. Every layer was anchored to the skull underneath and to real measurements of real people from his homeland. And then she reached the nose. The nose is where this whole story turns, because the nose was the hardest part of all, and Wilkinson said so herself. The length and shape of a nose is worked out from the bones around it. But on this skull, those bones were wrong, broken. The nasal bones, sitting right between the eyes, had been badly fractured. In her own words, it must have been a very hefty blow, because it is the bones between the eyes that are broken. This was no small knock. Something struck St. Nicholas hard enough to break the bridge of his nose, and it healed the way a serious break heals when no one is there to set it. Crooked, uneven, leaving him, for the rest of his life, with a nose that sat slightly off-center and a rougher, tougher face than anyone sketching a jolly Santa would ever picture. There is one more thing worth knowing about that face. Wilkinson first attempted it back in 2004, working from the same set of records. Then, 10 years later, with sharper tools and better data, she and her colleague Mark Ruffley built it again, from the ground up inside the new face lab. This second version, the one that used the most current anatomical standards available, is the face the world finally saw. So put the whole thing together. On the 6th of December, 2014, on the feast day of St. Nicholas, the Face Lab at Liverpool John Moores University revealed the result of all of it. Not a cartoon, a real olive-skinned man from the Eastern Mediterranean, a heavy, square jaw, A strong, deeply lined face, a gray beard, close cut, dark, steady eyes that seem to look right back at you, and that broken nose, healed crooked, sitting right in the center of everything. It is the face of a man who was kind, yes, but also a man who had been through something, who had been struck and locked away, and had grown old carrying all of it in his body. You look at him and you do not see a mascot, you see a person, and somehow that makes the quiet gift-giving mean more, not less. This is where it becomes almost unfair to him, because the lean, broken-nosed bishop on that screen is not the figure we celebrate every December. Over the centuries, the real Nicholas slowly disappeared under his own story. Dutch families carried his feast day and his name, Sinterklaas, across the ocean to America. Writers and illustrators softened him, fattened him, wrapped him in fur, and handed him a sleigh and a team of reindeer. By the 20th century, advertising finished the job, dressing him in a bright red suit with a belly that shook like a bowl of jelly. Every step made him warmer and rounder and less real, until the actual man, the one with the crooked nose and the aching joints and the cold years in a cell, was gone completely, buried a second time, under a legend of our own making, which is what makes those bones matter so much. They are the one thing the story could not soften. Now, a fair question. How sure are we that these are really his bones? For a long time, that was a genuine fight, because Bari was not the only city claiming him. Venice claimed St. Nicholas too. Both cities insisted they held his true remains, and for centuries, neither would back down. So, in 1992, the same Professor Martino was finally allowed to examine the Venice bones as well. They came to him in hundreds of tiny fragments. But when he compared them to the skeleton in Bari, he found something quiet and remarkable. The Venice pieces were not a second body at all. They were the missing parts of the first one. Bones that were absent in Bari turned up in Venice. Set side by side, they fit together like one broken skeleton split between two cities. Then, years later, the science reached even further. In 2017, researchers at the University of Oxford took a small fragment of bone long said to belong to St. Nicholas and ran radiocarbon dating on it. The result came back, the 4th century, the exact era Nicholas lived and died in. The lead scientist, Tom Higham, was careful about what that actually means. Science, he said, cannot prove that these are the bones of the saint. It can only prove that they are not. And this bone passed that test. It is old enough, it comes from the right time. It could, in principle, be him. A real man, a real grave, a real face, rebuilt from the bones of someone who lived and gave and was buried under his own name 17 centuries ago. So the next time you see him on a card, in the red suit, with the soft round cheeks and the twinkle in his eye, hold the other face in your mind for a moment. The old bishop from Myra, the crooked nose, the worn-out joints, the bags of gold thrown through a window in the dark by a man who never waited around to be thanked. That face is real. We have finally seen it. But there is still a piece of him missing, because the bones we can find are only part of the story. And far away in Turkey, in the very town where Nicholas actually died, there is a church where some believe the rest of him may still be lying in the ground, untouched, unopened, waiting. That is the search that could rewrite all of this yet again. And that is exactly where we are going next.